Welcome everyone. This is our, which one is it? Sorry. Yet another CPR-CSH workshop series. And this one is called Testing the Waters, Young Women's Work and Mobile Aspirations in India's Small Cities. And the speaker today is someone who basically runs CPR-CSH workshops. Like, I don't know who else does it better than her, Mukta Nayak. She's a fellow at CPR, and sorry, Partha and everyone else, she basically runs it, sorry. She's an architect and urban planner. She has also now gradually moved towards more scholarly interests, but her interests are towards housing and urban poverty and urban informality and internal migrations. She's a prolific writer on all these issues and someone who can really write very lucidly on complex issues around urbanity. And I benefit greatly from her writings. She's a graduate of School of Planning and Architecture and has a master's degree in urban and regional planning from Texas A&M University. She's currently pursuing a PhD in urban development and governance in the Institute of Housing and Urban Development Studies, IHS, Erasmus University, Rotterdam. So over to you, Mukta. And this is a short introduction, I know, but I just want to hear you first.
In urban work come to our CPR-CSH talk. So it's always a great place to get feedback. And we've seen a lot of people, benefit from it. And I'm hoping to do the same. The paper I'm presenting today is part of 4 papers that I'm writing for my PhD research. This is number 3. It's already published, but there's a paper preceding this that actually lays the larger context that is still stuck in the publication corridors of academia. So yeah, I mean, hopefully the feedback that I get from today can also be channeled into that paper and in future writings. So without much delay, I will just share my screen, and then can you all see my screen? Yeah.
Yes.
So I started in 2016 or so. The Center for Policy Research and Just Jobs Network got a grant from the IDRC, which is a Canadian grant-making organization, to do some work on youth employment in small cities in India. The background was that CPR had a project on subaltern urbanization, in which a number of researchers had been examining different sites across India, which were small towns, looking at various aspects of production, labor, economic activity, and so on and so forth. Some of you would be familiar with that literature on subaltern urbanization. And for me, as somebody who was getting interested in migration, it seemed logical to ask questions around what was happening with migration in cities that were not metropolitan centers. So that's sort of the background from where the questions for this research emerged. We did look at it in an economic context. The large context was of structural transformation, where are the non-farm jobs, and what is the role of migration for young people who are seeking employment. We saw that in the literature, there was a lot of focus on metropolitan centers as places of opportunity. So there was a lot of literature coming out of Bombay and Delhi, and historically the big metros in Delhi. But then this emerging literature, as I mentioned, on subaltern urbanization was also pointing to the fact that smaller towns, small cities were also economically dynamic and vibrant in the Indian context. Small cities were also being theorized as in-between spaces in the larger, in global literature. Bell and Jane calls them in-between spaces, where they are not parochial like the rural, but not, don't have like a lot of opportunity and the kind of agglomeration effect that metropolitan centers provide. So what really happens here? Some work out of Africa done by the World Bank actually positions these places as action spaces. So they call it, this literature is in the context of secondary towns, which are perceived as action spaces for rural youth who don't have the means to migrate or move as far as the big city, but are able to go to smaller towns nearby and, test opportunities. So testing the waters, in a sense, comes from that kind of a notion. And the larger question is of what is the role of smaller cities in the migration trajectories of younger people. Simultaneously, the idea of youth and aspirations has also been looked at within this mobilities framework. The mobilities paradigm actually looked beyond the binaries of mobile versus static or global versus local and had a more relational approach. This allowed scholars to think of the kind of mobilities, not just of people, but of ideas, of technologies, of goods, and also of mobilities in terms of different durations and frequencies of movements, which sometimes were hard to consider when countries had very specific definitions of migration. So Robertson, some of this work, which is emerging actually out of youth studies, talks about how youth, they construct aspirations for work, for education, for social relations, for lifestyle, through aspirations and desires for mobility itself. So being mobile, moving, becomes a very key part of how they imagine their lives going forward. But the literature also reminds us that these mobilities or these opportunities are also unevenly experienced. So while some may have the resources, the means, the connections to move, others may not, and may actually have very little agency in whether they can actually relocate or travel or commute to look at opportunities. So gender, caste, class, and even spatial location, in the sense of whether you are in a small town or a large city, may have an effect on whether you can actually leverage these mobile aspirations and build on them or not. So there's this question of mobilities versus immobilities that this literature brings to the fore. I built in this paper, in my larger work, I'm using this for the entire data set of my survey, and I'll come to my methods a little bit later. But in this particular paper, I look specifically at the narratives of young women in my sample. And the reason I'm doing this is because this question of the participation of women in the labor force has been very salient in India for the last few years. Even here at CPR, my colleagues have done some work on it. In another project, we are looking, for example, at the participation of women in the digital employment ecosystem, the platform ecosystem that's appearing, and whether that actually helps get more women or get women, help women get better jobs. And those kind of questions have been part of the thinking, emerging thinking, as I've worked at CPR over the last 7 years. But in the migration context, and as we know, the urban labor force participation of women is particularly dismal, and it really goes to the questions that have animated public discourse before COVID, and specifically during COVID, where we are constantly reminded that women are bearing the disproportionate load of reproductive labor, care burdens, and therefore are kind of trapped in certain kinds of patriarchal structures, because of which they are discouraged, whether through decisions taken by other people or even through their own internalized notions of patriarchy, from joining the workforce. In the context of migration, women have largely been in India sort of show up in the data as marriage migrants and not really conceived as labor migrants. And even though there's work which shows that in certain feminized occupations like garments, home-based manufacturing, domestic work, women migrants are actually breadwinners at destination. It's also very clear that women are very prevalent in family-based migration sectors, construction, brick making, very visible in urban informal services, and even in emerging services sectors like education, hospitality, and healthcare. The numbers, of course, that the data captures are still small, but this is a visible workforce that sort of merits attention, both in terms of what the women who are already in there have negotiated to be able to be working, and why are more women not able to join these sectors, as well as break those glass ceilings and be part of sectors that are not feminized or seen as appropriate kind of work for women. Coming back to the question of smaller cities, the word ordinary here is a reference to Jennifer Robinson's work, who really points attention to the importance of cities that are kind of off the map, that are not global, that are not sort of hogging the headlines, the media headlines and the attention, and that important things could also be happening in these ordinary places. So sort of taking off on that, in this particular paper, I look at my case cities as these kind of ordinary places where exciting things may or may not be happening. And the theoretical framework that I've been using for both these papers of my PhD, which the one preceding this, which talks about the larger, which talks about youth in general, and this one which zeroes down on women, is sort of this idea that which Schiller and Chaglar have proposed, which their work is, of course, in the context of neoliberalism and globalization, where they look at the scalar position of cities. So they say that the opportunities for migrants, and this is, of course, work done in the context of global migration, which I am trying to transpose onto the internal migration scenario and really see whether it applies or whether it needs some more critical examination. In my PhD work, I'm not very comfortable with this sort of bucketing of migration work as global migration and internal migration, simply because I feel like there's a lot that both these different literatures can learn from each other, but not much crossover in the world of migration theory that has happened. So I found this framework interesting because it essentially divides cities into different scalar positions. So the top two scalar positions are more global cities, which are powerful in terms of economic, cultural, which have more economic and cultural power, and which are very interconnected at the global scale. And then the lower scale cities, which are operating at a more regional scale and do not have those kind of global connections. So in this context, feminist scholars have also pointed out that smaller cities have limited economic opportunity, and they impose greater social constraints as compared to the metropolis, which is sort of presented as a place of great opportunity. And in the case of women, this opportunity, this freedom, including sexual freedoms, comes at that risk of being sexualized and being under surveillance. So there's, this is the Weiloiter kind of train of thought, where you say that in a city like Mumbai actually allows you to do so much. So that idea of anonymity can be very powerfully leveraged, but at the same time, you still remain objects that have to perform modesty all of the time in order to be acceptable and to get these freedoms. So I'm trying to ask these questions in the context of the smaller cities, which don't have these more glamorous positions and more economic opportunities. I'm also building on that new mobilities paradigm to think about cities as assemblages of people, ideas, technologies, which are connected through mobilities and through different kinds of networks. So the question really is that if cities are constantly being reconfigured, then can these shifting assemblages offer some opportunities for women? Or is a smaller city kind of a bigger form of the village, where women are sort of inscribed in very, very specific positions, and they have only those points of access? So this is the sort of background and the literature inside which I was thinking when I was writing this paper. The gender literature itself, and I've already alluded to a little bit of this, is very clear that women are socialized to operate within a sense of limits. This is sort of a Bourdieusian understanding of an individual's sense of limits and possibilities and constraints. And this happens because women internalize patriarchy in certain ways, in which intra-household negotiations function effectively as implicit contracts with other members of the households, where claims and negotiations are specified and negotiated. So Naila Kabir has obviously done a lot of this work in the context of London and Bangladesh. And Denise Candioti, also a sociologist, actually looks at this, calls this the patriarchal bargain. So she says that women actually negotiate to maximize their life chances without actually challenging the structure of patriarchy. So how much can I push before I get the backlash, before I get sexualized, before I'm, slotted into some sort of a preconceived evil slot that I'm socialized to understand that women who step outside the boundaries are. So this patriarchal bargain struck me as a very interesting concept. As my colleague Isha, who used to be with us at CPR and is now pursuing her PhD, as she and me were doing the field work, we constantly evoked, and we saw so many instances of this kind of bargaining that Candioti really seemed to speak to us. And so the notion here is really that, these individual power tactics and to some extent the role of collectives is what is really pushing or enabling women's opportunities, but that these also vary with regional forms of patriarchy. Why regional patriarchy is important for my paper is because my case studies are located in North and Southern India. So they're located in different parts of India. So we actually see that there are slightly regional versions of patriarchy that are in operation and that women have to negotiate with. These are the case studies. Kishangarh is the three pictures on top. It's basically a marble and granite processing cluster. In recent years, it's got a lot of infrastructure investment, highways. The picture you see in the middle of it is of the new railway station because it's on the dedicated freight corridor, which is sort of a sister project to the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor. It's got a Adani Logistics Park. It's got a new airport. So there's been a bunch of new infrastructure investments that have actually put Kishangarh on the map and made its marble and stone processing cluster far more connected to regional, national, and even global value chains in a way that it wasn't before. Mangaluru, on the other hand, and Gaurav is also doing some research there and sitting with me, is a different kind of a city. It's larger than Kishangarh. It's in that sense, this research is a little bit of a dissimilar case study kind of an approach because the cities are not exactly comparable in terms of population sizes, though both are sort of below the 1 million mark that sort of makes them into metropolitan in terms of the Indian imagination of metropolitan cities. So Mangalore has an old industrial port and an old industrial sort of complex, which is now kind of deindustrializing and then being replaced by a bunch of new service sectors, including retail, hospitality, healthcare, a big education hub, and so on and so forth. In both locations, local, especially rural elites from the region are playing a very big role in bringing these new investments and sort of recharging the economies of these cities. The data that I collected was a survey in both cities of young people between 15 and 29 in terms of age, as well as focus group discussions, as well as key informant interviews. So it's a largish sort of a database of qualitative and as well as a survey. But in this particular paper, the survey results and the qualitative data mostly established context, and the specific narratives that I present today are from 6 FGDs and 7 key informant interviews with young women in particular, which I found interesting and relevant to this particular paper. So I won't repeat this. Just the notion is that when Schiller and Chaglar talk about scale, we can see that Kishangarh and Mangalore have very, very different local contexts, but both cities have made efforts to rescale themselves and sort of go up the scale, either through these logistics and infrastructure improvement or through new sort of trying to push to new sectors, but have had limited efforts at either diversifying or at really sort of translating that into a better quality of life for residents or a more vibrant economy that there is a limit to which, so for example, Kishangarh is branded as this marble city, and everybody you talk to will keep incessantly talking about marble. But when you actually go and visit there, all of the industry is sort of focused in some industrial parts of the city, and the rest of the city is very much in the old mold of having an old city and having more traditional kind of neighborhoods and developments, which are still segregated by caste and religion and so on. So that's what I mean by saying that the rescaling efforts or the rebranding efforts are sometimes not visible in terms of the city as a whole. In terms of sectoral composition of women's work, it was actually very much harder for us to find working women in the sample in Kishangarh. So it was quite a challenge, and you can see that in the numbers as well. And you can also see that in Mangalore, a lot of the women are concentrated in sort of what I would think of as mid-skill occupations. So I'm thinking cashiers at or sales attendants in retail malls, cashiers at offices or hospitals, or nurses, hotel employees. So this is the kind of profile of working women in Mangalore, whereas in Kishangarh, a lot of the women are in sanitation, domestic work, cleaning services, and those kind of jobs. So much more in the low informal, low end work. So I'll come to the meat of what I'm trying to say today, and I'll present some narratives from Kishangarh, which actually really show how even within this of course, they're seeking autonomy. Very clearly to prioritize marriage and family over individual ambitions, marry partners their families choose, all of which within the bounds of caste and religion. The kind of issues that young women brought up, which were points of tension with their families, were essentially studying outside Kishangarh and working outside the home. Both of these were fraught issues. But they imagined futures where economic autonomy is necessary. In focus groups that we did in the city, young women constantly evoked scenarios like divorce, the death of a husband abandoning me, all sorts of sort of dire scenarios, but essentially going to say that economic autonomy is not negotiable. It's definitely something that I want to aspire to, and that is my goal, but I'm not quite sure how to get there. And the ideas about mobility were very much intertwined with this kind of notion of their future. So one of the simplest ways they could sort of engage in the patriarchal bargain was by choosing gender suitable sectors or profiles of work. So women would be in government jobs, that is of course the most aspirational thing, or in teaching in an NGO school or in a charitable school. It's an industrial city, a lot of charitable schools running there, usually with women teachers in them, and a lot of home-based work. And here you are sort of working within accepted boundaries and focusing on negotiating very small freedoms. So like Seema, who does handmade cards at home, makes a modest income and says, I don't have to go anywhere, nobody can object, but I also get some money on the side. So this is the one level sort of negotiation. The other, of course, key axis, and this won't be a surprise to most of us, because I mean, this is something we hear of everywhere, whether metro or small city, from young women, is this constant dealing and negotiation of marriage. So we heard about how there was so much pressure on themselves to excel academically, so that parents can't use academic failure as an excuse for early marriages. We have to remember that this is Rajasthan. It's a part of Rajasthan where child marriages are still prevalent. So a big part, in Kishangarh is very intertwined with its rural hinterland. So a lot of people we interviewed in Kishangarh actually don't think of Kishangarh as a city. They kind of think of it as a place where a lot of different kinds of people live, but they are much more socially connected with the villages, which may be, in a 30-40 minute commuting distance from the city. So better education is seen as a tool that can help them negotiate within their families for husbands with more social status, income potential, located in better locations, and so on. But a lot of very enterprising women, I mean, a few at least that we interviewed, actually leveraged education and networks to start entrepreneurial careers in Kishangarh. So, for example, Poonam did her undergraduate and master's degrees in Jaipur, where she stayed with relatives and very much stayed within the bounds of her family's social networks, but brought those ideas and those new ideas back and started a business in English speaking and education. It was quite stellar to see how she had actually become a role model for so many young women in the city, just by teaching them, and even parents, young mothers who would come to her to learn better English diction so that they could go and speak with more confidence at the parent teacher meeting, for instance. So there were very small sort of ways in which women were trying to improve their positions, not just in the labor market, but also in society, and carve out that autonomous space within their homes. And even this very dynamic girl kept talking about first how she's delaying marriage by doing this business, but also how she's building a respectable and flexible business that her future in-laws, whom she was assuming would be conservative, would not have a problem with. So you have this assemblage of mobilities and network and skills, but you also have a very clear sense of limits that is being expressed by women who come across as, in the way they dress and in the way they talk, it seems like they could fit into the corporate world in Mumbai or wherever, but their sense of limits is very much grounded in the realities of their home city. And then there were young girls who pushed even further through multiple bargains. And this example stands out. So this is Snehal, who's actually a protege of my previous respondent, who initially just convinced her father to let her study, come to Noida to do her master's. And the patriarchal bargain there was that I will return promptly if my wedding is finalized, knowing very well that once she's studying in Noida, nobody is going to ask her to come back and sort of drop her degree halfway and come and get married. Then when she gets back after her degree, she seeks voluntary and social work at an NGO to normalize mobilities outside the home, to sort of socialize this idea among her family that she's going to get up in the morning, take public transport, go somewhere, do something, come back, be out of their purview for a few hours every day. And then she offers this bolder bargain. She basically, at that point of time, a private girls' college opens in Kishangarh, and she takes this idea to her uncle of starting a girls' PG, a paying guest accommodation for girls. And she builds on her own experience of living in Noida, becomes a partner in her uncle's business, while constantly talking about while constantly appearing to be subservient and talking about her work as within the fold of the family business. And in her work, and I'm not reading this into it, she's actually saying you have to take initiative, you have to be selfish to be taken seriously. So it's very tactical, the work that she's doing here. It's not just this that it turned out this way, it's actually her ideas and her entrepreneurial ambition that she's trying to pursue, but within the fold and within the limits of that family business. Another example which struck out in the sample that we examined was this 18-year-old Dalit girl who lives in Kotri village, which is an hour outside Kishangarh. We were conducting interviews here to understand the aspirations of village girls who commute to Kishangarh to study, and then would they actually translate that education into employment, or what kind of aspirations did that education lead them to. And in the focus group, whereas 2 girls had sort of gone on to study in Kishangarh, 3 had dropped out of school because the school was in the village and their families were not really too keen on them doing this long commute to Kishangarh in public transport. Seema was teaching in the NGO school, and her bargain with her husband's family was essentially to delay college. She's very bright. So her bargain was that I will delay college by a year and teach in this NGO school, and till her husband preps for the government job. So the deal was that the husband has 1 year to do this. And when I'm saying deal, this deal was actually negotiated before her marriage in the presence of her father and her to-be husband's uncles, which really speaks of a lot of initiative on part of a girl in her position. And in return for her doing this, she expects to study on her own terms, which includes traveling to the city, which also includes not performing modesty in the way that her family would like her to. So in her sort of narratives, she's far more assertive. She's asking questions like, if freedom is so conditional, it's really not freedom for me. If you're saying you can study, but you have to wear a sari, you have to take this kind of transport, you can only attend classes that are between 12 p.m. and 3 p.m. because it's, you have to do housework before you go and you have to tend to the cattle after you come back and so on and so forth, then that is not useful for me. So she's negotiating all these conditions sort of in preparation for this college experience that she imagines is down the line. And of course, we know that some of these will not translate into reality, and so does she. But the idea that that aspiration is there and she's using that aspiration to negotiate is what was really interesting to me. I will pivot to the Mangalore experience. And of course, in Mangalore also, there were many, many girls who represented very similar, not similar, but similar kinds of patriarchal bargains. So the whole pursuit of acceptable professions, or assuaging your family's concerns about safety by choosing jobs that don't need you to work late, and all those kind of things that women do. All that was definitely going on. But what was interesting about Mangalore was that there were institutions that mediated some of this. And that's also on account of it being a larger city with more opportunities in services sector, mid-level jobs, higher levels of education across the board, safe and efficient transport, decent public infrastructure. So women had a lot more access to the public sphere, which allowed them to build social connections, have conversations outside their very limited family and social contexts, and therefore use those connections to access new opportunities. So in that context, though caste and religion continue to act as mediators, though patriarchal bargains remain important, and even in a context where Mangalore specifically and that belt has been there has been a set of socially conservative political groups which have been very active in laying down moral rules. So for example, a young girl and a young boy sitting in a car are likely to get sort of assaulted by these groups and sort of asked whether they are brother and sister or who they are. And those kind of things do happen in places like Bangalore. So there is this socially conservative underlayer to all of their interactions. Yet it's a more cosmopolitan city, more diverse in terms of religions, languages spoken, people coming in from different parts of the country, and so on and so forth. So we found that in Mangalore, women, in women's work itself, a lot of unions were active, and they negotiated wages, work conditions, both with the employer and with the state. These were, of course, again, like I mentioned right up front, the opportunities are not equal, right? So they were less accessible to migrants who come from outside the state, to new entrants, but very much accessible to those who are from, say, North Karnataka, who have come to Mangalore and are now working as domestic workers. They've been around for 5-6 years. They don't have a language barrier. They were able to access these informal collectives and unions to move ahead. For example, we were in the Assistant Labor Commissioner's office, and there was a dispute resolution happening with a women's informal group that felt that was a group of port workers, so head load carriers, but women head loaders who felt that they had they were coming to object because toilets had been built for them, but they had been locked up by the port authorities. So they were there to sort of intercede and to find a way to maintain them and to make sure that they were accessible to their members. Institutions, a network of institutions offered entry points, and then they themselves became networks for women to find jobs, access employment in the city. For example, Dalit youth specifically told us about how evening classes and caste-based scholarships were really important for them because they didn't have the option to not earn while they were studying. And this was across the board for men and women. And a lot of these young women are now in professions like nursing or healthcare, where then they actually gain a kind of respectability and an access into upper caste homes that then enhances their social networks and their position in society. So this sort of institutions like of support that mediate that entry point were constantly brought up by young women in Mangalore. Also, the idea that they enabled entry of women into non-typical occupations. So we found skilling institutions that took in women in electronics, in machine operation, in computer, of course, in computer operations, because a lot of women were going on to become accountants and front desk managers and so on and so forth. But at the same time, the complaint was that the official skilling schemes like NULM and so on and so forth are not accessible to older women. So for example, women in their 30s who want to enter work after their children have grown a little bit older are not actually able to access the skilling schemes that the government provides or endorses. So these kind of sort of a lack of sensitivity to the life cycle of women was something that came up very clearly in the Mangalore interviews. And I suspect the reason for that awareness is also because of these collectives and unions, which are constantly raising awareness about rights, entitlements, and issues like that. So I'll sum up. I can see that there are already some questions, but I'll take a little bit of time on this slide. So the case studies tell me that these smaller cities, these non-metropolitan cities, are action spaces where women can test the waters. So they may not have very clear and very smooth pathways into employment, but definitely they can enter. So firstly, despite the invisibility in the migration data, we can see that young women are engaging in different forms of mobilities, even though patriarchal structures are urging stasis. So even in Mangalore, when somebody is coming in from a town 2 hours away to be trained in nursing, and they require to actually stay in a paying guest accommodation, they have to negotiate that notion of why do you have to stay away, etc. But in Mangalore, those institutions are able to provide the assurance that they are safe places, and in Kishangarh, that is not, those kind of institutions either don't exist, or the kind of regional patriarchies are so strong that they're not really able to provide the assurance to families that the women require. These kind of mobilities, whether they are mobilities sort of, so when I say mobilities, I see them in a life cycle frame. So for example, when I'm talking about Snehal and Poonam, they went away outside the city to study, and then they came back. So that previous mobility and the experiences linked with it are actually being leveraged in certain ways. So there's a certain circulation of ideas that is coming because they were able to step out and then step back in with a new frame of mind. And they were able to place themselves in an embodied fashion in a completely new context where the conditioning of their youth was not in operation. So these new ideas actually build mobile aspirations for the future, because they actually shift perceptions around limits and possibilities that were created in their growing up years. And in small cities, these opportunities may be limited, but they're also low risk and low cost ways for women to test these aspirations. So instead of going to a larger city where you need a certain pay level to survive, to pay the rent, you need to know someone there who is willing to keep you in their home, otherwise your family is not going to let you go there. And in a metropolis, to find someone who has the space to have an extra person means it has to be a really close relation or an acquaintance, which again ties you into certain networks of caste, and restricts those mobilities for people who are not are from disadvantaged communities. So the small city represents this space of action, which is low risk, and where you can actually avail the option of strategic retreat. So something doesn't work out, you can always go back saying, okay, it didn't work out. You know, you can always say yes to the marriage proposal. You can always, say, I will do home-based work like everyone else is doing. So that's how the women, that's how young girls were actually seeing this. They had aspirations, but they were also very real in the way they were framing the possibilities of converting these aspirations into reality for them. Education, employment, and marriage remain the key sites of bargaining and contestation for these girls. Also access to public space, but it doesn't come out as a very clear objective. Like, I want to be free in the sense of free to roam the city was not a big articulation. This could also be a function of the bias of the study itself, which sort of tried to look at labor market opportunities and experiences. And lastly, as you can see, the quality of public spaces and infrastructure, the existence of collectives, institutions actually catalyze this process of pursuing mobile aspirations. So where they are absent, young women are limited to these intra-household forms of bargaining, which was the first set of examples that I offered you from Kishangarh, where you can be extremely creative, but the limits of your bargaining are within your household. So really, I mean, just to extend to what we did in terms of putting out the policy briefs and in terms of the policy side of the project, we did explore these kind of ideas in terms of if you were looking at place-based interventions from an urban planning or an urban governance lens, what would you do in smaller sized cities to be able to enable, to be able to create these kinds of institutions, these kind of safe spaces? Is it possible to do? And the tension there really is that a lot of these institutions are funded and set up by elites who are from the more powerful castes and communities in the city. So that's the sort of, from a political economy lens, that's the sort of tension you run up against, where, for example, in Kishangarh, the school is sort of supported by RK Marbles. The hospital in the city is supported by the Kishangarh Marble Association. So constantly, even education and healthcare access is through these very caste-based kind of networks. And so can you really, as a planner or as a city manager or as a state government wanting to change something, how much can you do by yourself, because you have to do it in collusion with these existing power structures within the city. And Mangalore, even though it's larger and more diverse in terms of its population, is very much similar in the sense of how it is organized. In fact, one would say that it is even more entrenched in the structure of the city in terms of how much of the city's planning and governance mechanisms are actually influenced by private actors who have the money, the power, the political influence to set the agenda for the government. And that sort of circles us back to this question of the agency of the city, and how do we change that? How do we change that on at the scale of the city itself? So I'll stop there. This is just to connect sort of a set of narratives and stories and experiences that I collected over my fieldwork, which were very individual in their nature, into the larger thinking around cities and governance and planning. Yeah, open to questions.
Thank you so much, Mukta. That was so full of, I mean, there are so many questions which can go from so many directions. Let me first, so there are two questions and I saw some hands raised. Oh, they're not raised anymore, but never mind. We'll start with the questions which are at the chat. Anirudh Datta, do you want to ask your question? Wait, I'll just unmute you. Anirudh, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, the two questions that I had, thanks for this very interesting presentation. The first one was, I would like to understand, if you've looked at this, the reasons and drivers for the decline, and then the sharp increase in the number of census towns in the 2001 and 2011 census respectively. And what are the opportunities in this town if you have looked at it at all? That was the first question.
Why don't you ask?
Yeah. Do you want to ask your second question?
The second
Sure.
question, no? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And the second one was, what has changed according to you, which enables someone like Seema, the example that you gave, to negotiate with a family? And do you think it's a broader trend, or is Seema more of an exception in the rule?
Thanks, Anuradha. Both, I mean, all three great questions. I won't really get into reasons for the decline. I think there are mixed, there are lots of people who have been investigating that question. My own sense is that this question of infrastructure and the social entrenched patriarchy, plus the infrastructure question of, can you make transport safe? Can you make workplaces safe? So, I mean, there's a lot going on there, but I won't venture it as sort of the main reason because that's not my expertise. I did frame my question within that larger context, but that was not the purpose of this particular project, to investigate that in particular. I think the census towns question I would respond to in the sense of the spectrum of transitions. So when I was looking at Kishangarh, and I could really see that it was sort of a corridor kind of a transformation, where on that corridor, all these various towns that were seeing infrastructure investments were changing in terms of the nature, the economic nature. And I would imagine that that is happening down the scale to villages that are on that kind of corridor as well. So the reasons for why census towns are coming up, again, not something I can answer, but I do have colleagues who work extensively in this.
Sure.
But I think the transformation is linked to the idea that a lot of economic activity is happening in many different dispersed places, that we are not saying that Sheher, the city is a place where there is manufacturing and services and so, and the village is a place where there's only agriculture, and that's not really the landscape anymore. And the census towns is sort of the big data point that tells us that very clearly. On Seema, I don't think it's a one-off case. I think there is, and I would sort of talk about, that's why I found the new mobilities paradigm and that sort of theorization interesting, because this idea of circulation of ideas and aspirations was very strong, not just in women, but also in the men that we interviewed. So, for example, in a lot of the agrarian sort of the literature, we talk about this idea of the Bidesiya who comes back to the village and then, socializes, talks about the city and creates this notion and this narrative of this very aspirational space, and therefore builds that aspiration. So it's something like that, where the streaming of the kind of media that we are seeing, Bollywood, all of that is combining, I think, to sensitize households that something has shifted, that I cannot. So the performance of modesty is also being negotiated with every new set of kids who are growing into adults.
Right.
So they what you wear, how you can speak to your elders, what you're allowed to do or not do, what you can do as an unmarried girl versus what is that change that you have to bring in the minute you get married. Then while you're negotiating your marriage, the idea of searching for liberal in-laws is a very strong idea again in the minds of young girls, which many of them are able to convey and actually actively negotiate with their families. So it's not a one-off, but of course everything that I'm saying is very much a class, in a certain class of people where this is possible to do. There are also other sections of society, for example, in Valmiki's in Kishangarh, where women's workforce participation is not an issue at all, because every Valmiki is working for a sanitation contractor if they're an adult.
Right.
Regardless of whether they are male or female, whether they are married or unmarried, if they are adult and they can work, they are working for a sanitation contractor. Either a contractor who does municipal sanitation or somebody who handles sanitation, cleaning services inside factory premises, and so on and so forth. And that's the story of caste-based occupations, which is a separate story, but which is also has an impact on the kind of work that is available to women. And I suspect the fact that so much of our sample in the survey is sort of concentrated in cleaning services, all those women would, if I were to do a cross tab, they would almost certainly be from those castes which are already practicing sanitation work. So yeah, that's
Thank you very much. That's very interesting.
Okay, I don't see any more questions, any hands raised. Oh, wait, there's Tarini. Tarini, do you want to, wait, I'll just unmute you and then you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was since we were talking about patriarchal bargain a lot, and I just wanted to know, so can we sort of generalize in some way as to what kind of bargain might work better? That is to study first or to start working first. As in, there's one case when a girl was pushing her limits and she did her master's in Noida and then went on to, and then we talked about it later as well, that once you study, you don't have to worry about earning and you can stay in a PG, all of those options. But then there's also a case where we talk about a particular person negotiating that she can delay her college but work in an NGO first. So I was just trying to understand if there is.
Yeah, so in those particular cases, I think the difference was the rural and the urban location of those particular girls, where for the rural woman, the access to education itself was hard because it actually involved a commute and a caste location where there was not the means to send her away to hostel to study. I mean, that was not even part of her aspiration. So I think it's sort of that intersectional thing that you see, that where your caste location, your spatial location, and your family circumstances comes together with what you're imagining. I mean, that's what informs your imagination. But to answer your question, I think studying is definitely like the first and most important aspiration that was expressed. In our sample, we were mostly talking to women, young girls who were either already studying or recent graduates. So we didn't, for example, interview school kids. Like we didn't interview people who were in the 14 to 18 age group. And I suspect that if we did, we would have definitely found. So it's like a step ladder for them. So and that is also caste location based. So if I am from a caste where the chances of me getting work is easy if I sort of remain within that caste-based occupation network, and I don't have the resources, and that's not the done thing in the community to study beyond grade 8 or grade 9. Grade 8 is sort of the cutoff, or grade 10 sometimes, depending on the cutoff for sanitation jobs in government, which is what people keep applying for, and if they get it, great. So it's really dependent on that. So the studying is more transactional or more like a necessity in certain communities. In other communities, it's about buying time. So you do a bachelor's and then you even sometimes push for a master's in that bid to delay marriage. And the whole issue of employment and patriarchal bargain in employment it becomes less of an issue the higher you go in the caste spectrum, because the mobility restrictions keep increasing, because the performance of respectability and the idea of honor is more and more entrenched the higher your caste location. So the question of you working outside the home in a place like Kishangarh would be a big question for your family to negotiate if you are from an upper caste household. In Mangalore, it's less, it's more common, but their religion, for example, interviews with young Muslim women, the same kind of patriarchal situation context that Kishangarh may upper caste women were facing was being faced by Muslim girls from the Muslim community in Kishangarh, where there was no question of them working outside the home. So the only place where they could bargain was for education and skill development, sometimes without being able to answer what you're going to use that education or skill for. And nobody was really asking those questions if they were from decently well-off middle class or well-off homes.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, something went off with my internet. So there's another question from Anushri, and somebody has raised her hand. Maybe we'll take Anushri's, and then Pushpa, you could talk because Anushri sort of raised her hand first. Oh, sorry, put her question first. All right, go ahead, Anushri.
Yeah, hi, Mukta. Thank you so much for that really amazing presentation. So some of my PhD work also looks at women, and like I'm looking more closely at the kind of entrepreneurial activities that women are involved in relation to the platform economy, etc. So that's where this question is sort of stemming from. But I was really curious around, like you did talk about specific things that women were doing as entrepreneurial actors, and so like I was just generally wondering if you had something to more say about the kind of entrepreneurial things that you saw, and how those sort of blur the boundaries between what we can think of as tactics or strategies that women have to sort of like, and the sort of negotiations that they have to make to as part of this patriarchal bargain that you talked about, but also like when does it become entrepreneurialism, and how are those boundaries blurred? So is that something that you noticed, or is that something that you've been thinking around in your work? And if you can just like elaborate on these instances that you found.
No, yeah, thanks, Anushree. It sort of, frankly, I didn't look at it from the lens of entrepreneurialism because entrepreneurs were few and far between in my data. But yes, in these particular examples, and not just among women, even among men, among the qualitative interviews that I did on the FGDs that I did among men or in mixed groups, I did capture the idea of entrepreneurial, especially among youth who came from business communities. So this is something that is very clear in terms of entrepreneurial work, like in terms of setting up businesses. In terms of entrepreneurship as a characteristics, one saw that in many different women, whether they were practicing entrepreneurial occupation, I mean, whether their work itself was entrepreneurial nature in terms of setting up a business and running it or not. For example, the example from Kotri village, she was extremely entrepreneurial in her thinking because she was really like going out of the box and saying, and actually using emotional blackmail with her father, who also works in the NGO, saying, what is the point of you working in an NGO for so long and teaching the whole world about women's empowerment if you're getting your daughter married at 18? I mean, this is the kind of stuff that she was telling us. And this is how she sort of shamed her father into getting into a bargain. And so one sees the kind of initiatives and the risks that one would associate with entrepreneurialism. But if we just talk about entrepreneurship in terms of opening businesses, women tended to open businesses that, so in both cases, whether men or women, they were definitely taking business capital from friends, from family and relatives. So that was very clear, which is why I talked about caste-based avenues. But the kind of work that they did, the women chose very much these gender accepting kind of, roles. So teaching, sewing, boutiques, those are the kind of businesses that women started. So the PG, the example of her setting up the PG was sort of out of that in that sense. But that is because, she came from a family that had real estate connections and she was able to see that. But she was different in the way she was able to think, and coming to a large city had done that. So, what the kind of opportunities that a Jaipur can offer you versus the kind of opportunities that a Noida or a NCR or staying in Mumbai can offer you. There's also a difference in the kind of ideas that they carry back home. So I haven't thought about it specifically, but that's what comes to mind if I were to just sort of try and answer it from what I know right now. But really would be interested to know more about your work at another time and connect.
Right. This is really fascinating. Thank you so much. Thank you for that answer.
All right, Pushpa, you can talk. Pushpa.
Hi. Thank you, Aparajita. And thank you, Mukta, for that excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I, as a person who has grown up in a much more conventional environment, and many of us would totally empathize with the narrative, as many of us have done similar negotiations within our patriarchal families to get some space, freedom, opportunities for education and work, both for conventional and some non-conventional opportunities. And in my personal case, these were totally unconventional. just a second. Hello. Just. आप फिर से भेज दीजिए। अब मैं आपको, आप फिर से फोन करिए आधे घंटे बाद। Sorry.
No problem.
This is a courier standing in the gate. I can't let him go away. So the story is very familiar and very touching to many of us. So that's the first point. The second is also an observation, is a comment on ordinary cities, that that discourse that you talked about right in the beginning. And in my opinion, some of these ordinary cities are not so ordinary. And many of them, if you look across, have very specialized economic activities. It could be an industry, it could be a craft. I was wondering, in case of Kishangarh, is it the same place which, other than stone and marble work, does also Kishangarh painting? So that's a question. Is it the same place? And Kishangarh is known by Kishangarh paintings, those miniatures we buy when we go on our way to Jaipur. So is it the same place? It's a small.
Yeah, totally agree that these are very familiar stories, and I've been grappling with this whole issue of, these stories are familiar to women across space and time. And so what is so special about these stories coming out of these spaces, these particular places? So this has always been sort of that voice of self-critique in my head. And I don't think I have a very convincing answer to that, only some beginnings maybe. On Kishangarh, yes, it is the same place, but very sadly, the crafts cluster there has completely deteriorated.
Oh,
So
that's sad.
Yeah. So we actually did interview people who were remnants of that, and they were barely able to make their ends meet. Their supply chains had got almost entirely disrupted. And that's also how the crafts economy is working, where mass productions of some of these are happening elsewhere, copying, what this cluster was originally doing, but the cluster itself is nearly dead. And even the entire arts and crafts cluster, and even like heritage, is not really something that they're being able to revive, because they've got completely sort of mesmerized with this notion of being the marble city. So this whole branding effort is very much about positioning themselves as a global center of production, rather than about the other attributes that they may have. And that's really strange, because it's so well connected with Pushkar and Ajmer and even Jaipur now by road, and it has the airport for Ajmer, that actually the entire road stretch between Ajmer and Kishangarh is becoming a tourism. I mean, it's becoming a hospitality stretch, because people are coming and staying there once and then commuting into Pushkar and Ajmer to do their tourism. But Kishangarh is not benefiting particularly from that. But if you see in the data that we've captured, there has been in terms of just your employment numbers, there is a diversification, little bit of a diversification from working in stone processing to the hospitality. So hotels and restaurants as a category is seeing youth employment. And that is not just on account of the marble industry, but also on account of all these infrastructure investments and the logistical sort of growth of it as a logistics center.
Okay, so I have two very specific small questions, Mukta.
Yeah.
This work of women in relation to their life cycle that you mentioned. In your cases, what was the incident of women working before marriage, dropping out, and looking for re-entry opportunities? What was the incidence of re-entry of women into work in your cases? That's one question. A second one, let me ask also, then you can answer both. Both are quite, I think, related. So we all know that both access to education and work, at times, in case of Valmiki's, forced work, at times voluntary work, voluntarily choosing to work, are differentiated by caste class background. So in your cases that you interviewed women, what was their social profile?
What was their social
Profile.
profile?
What kind of family?
Yeah, so we, so just to answer the first one, it's sort of hard to answer because our whole work was focused on women in between 15 and 29. So in Kishangarh, of course, that covered a sample that had been married, had 2 or 3 children, because the early marriage is very prevalent. Even in fact, the males in our sample were mostly married in Kishangarh. But there, the notion of marriage after work after marriage was pretty much only there in the lowest caste positions where not working is not an option anyway. So everybody was working, engaged in work. So the question of re-entry did not really come up because we weren't talking to that group. In Mangalore, we did, because we ended up trying to understand the role of collectives, because we found all these collectives, right? And that's why the question came up there about re-entry. So I don't think I could answer that in quantitative terms in any way, but definitely Mangalore is a city where there is an attempt for women to be working, because it's not a cheap city to live in, as in it's a well-to-do city. So you do need like better incomes to pay rent, to send your children to a good school, and so on and so forth. So there is a desire definitely for women to re-enter work, which we generally found across communities. And there again, very in Mangalore, we were able to really talk to a lot of Dalit youth again, because we found the role of activist groups and role of these institutions like evening classes, which were targeted towards Dalit youth, etc., to be very interesting in creating these aspirations and in sort of enabling these possibilities. So we were able to have a little bit more range in our sample. The survey, of course, is sampled in such a way that it covers. It's randomized, so it covers a bunch of groups. But the qualitative work in Kishangarh is kind of aligned at the upper and the lowest end of the caste spectrum, not so much in the middle, because it was hard to find people there. So we were either interviewing the marble entrepreneurs and their families and so on and so forth, or we were interviewing Dalits and people in informal work. But we didn't find it so easy to enter the trading community, the people who were like in the bazaar, and do these kind of very in-depth interviews with the women, because the women were not present in the bazaars, and entry into homes for these kind of interviews is harder.
Thanks. Okay, Riddhi Bhandari, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for a very compelling talk, Mukta. A quick question, and I hope I'm able to word this correctly or effectively, but I wanted to understand how the women's aspirations and mobilities, or aspirations for mobilities, relate with the aspirations of their male same age counterparts. Is there, do you sense a growing support, so to speak, where they both, men and women think that they can achieve respective and collective mobilities together? Or if we see a reiteration of competitive patriarchal control yet again?
So Riddhi, did you mean them as in direct relationship with each other, or just comparing the male and the female experience?
A generic sense of, I think at the level of perception, not necessarily one-on-one man and woman working together or sort of not letting the other work, but a general sense of, a general gendered relationship vis-a-vis mobilities and aspirations.
So, the segregation in terms of sectors was quite apparent, and even within the sectors, the roles were different. Some of the sectors, of course, like for example, in hospitality, you did see women and young men and young women in very similar profiles. But overall, even there, for example, I would see women in the role of cashier or handling front desk and young men in the role of people who are actually going to the rooms, carrying luggage, changing sheets. So there were all these kind of things. But interesting crossovers, for example, a lot of the domestic help in Kishangarh, when they need to earn more and they've done a lot of domestic work, they've actually started working in the back end kitchens of restaurants where they get paid more, which means they're working very long hours late into the night, and establishments are actually making arrangements for their transport to make that happen. And in that context, they are working side by side with men in a commercial kitchen. Now, if we know anything about commercial kitchen, that's a pretty bold thing for women to do. So it did come up in 2 or 3 different interviews, and it was also pointed out by the domestic worker union people that this is an emerging opportunity for women. So overall, Riddhi, to answer your question, a lot of women, even if they had the equal education as the males in their households or in their friend circles, still had a very different idea of what their limits or their freedoms and their potentials were as compared to males. So for a very clear example is Mangalore, very much like Kerala, sends a lot of young people away. So there's a lot of out migration from Mangalore, but it is very gendered. Except for nursing, almost all out migrants are males. Nursing is the only female-led out migration profession that I could find there. And there it's the reverse. The female will go, as a nurse will go first, get an opportunity, whatever, break in, and then the husband will follow. And for everyone else, it's the other way around. So even though the education levels may be the same, there is a clear sense, a different perception of what that women themselves have of what they aspire for or what they can do. I did not necessarily sense a pushback from young men in terms of, in fact, I was quite surprised in Kishangarh, the FGDs with young men are unusually woke in the sense that they're quite aware of the fact that it is a very gendered space. For example, FGDs with women, with men, marble machine operators, and people who are doing daily the work in the marble factories, who actually commute in from villages every day. They were the ones who told us that the roles of women in the village have changed, the social roles, because they are working all day and they have only 1 day off a month. So the men are basically never there. So it's the women who are doing bank work and government panchayat office work, and even things like social calls that were normally done by the males in the family, like somebody dies, somebody is born. There's a certain, it's a gendered scenario, right? Women have certain rituals and men have other rituals, but there was actually a blurring there happening because the men were simply not there to perform all those functions. So just to answer your question, that when you talk to co-workers, I did not necessarily see, what we hear, that there's a lot of pushback, that kind of thing. But when I spoke to managers, the gendered perceptions were clear.
Right.
So they had preconceived notions that girls will only work for 2 years, then they'll get married and go away, or, so on and so forth. So they were less willing to invest in female employees in a long-term sense. But didn't get that sense from the young people themselves.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Great. I believe there are questions from the floor. I forgot that this is hybrid. So please go ahead, Partha, Gaurav. I can't really see who has raised their hands. Please organize that.
Thanks, Aprajita. Samriddhi, you had a...
Yeah, so my question actually follows from your previous answer, that do these intra-household negotiations put limits on mobility in terms of, where, to what an extent of an area that you can go and study and you can go and work, like, because you covered a place in the north part and the place in the southern region of the country. Is it like the woman in Kishangarh would think of traveling until any south city? Will that kind of will that be affected by intra-household negotiations?
No, I think that's the difference between being in a Jaipur and being in a Kishangarh also. So a person growing up in Jaipur, if this family has means, would actually think of applying to an Ashoka for college or whatever. But in Kishangarh, I did not see. I mean, a lot of the people have, except for the very elite households, which again, the networks of information are global, right? In Mangalore, they're most definitely global. So they're not even thinking country. They are thinking Canada, US, Dubai, whatever. If I'm talking about elite households, but for non-elites, like for regular, for even the middle class, the imagination is very much of the region. Yeah. So Kishangarh is thinking Ajmer, is thinking Jaipur, and Delhi and Noida is also like far. And especially so when it comes to sending girls. In Mangalore was the destination. Mangalore is an education hub. So people from Mangalore were not going out to study. They were going out to work after finishing, or they were going out for engineering. So it's sort of a pre-university college hub. So it's PUC, that's 11th, 12th, a lot of people come. And they come from bigger cities to study in Mangalore because the quality of education and the kind of, it's like a quota kind of a situation, but for entry into, so people are sending Mangaloreans or people from that area who live in Bombay are sending their kids to Mangalore to live with relatives and do their 11th and 12th because they think they can crack the engineering entrance test. So the notion of how far we can go or to what kind of place we can go is also contingent on that question of social location and the imagination of that particular community in terms of what has been already normalized.
Right. Thank you.
Aarti, go ahead.
Very interesting. So I have a couple of questions actually. One is, this is more of a comment, but I found it very interesting that a term like a social science term like patriarchal bargaining transforms into an actual deal sometimes, like an informal deal between the young woman and her family. And this is somewhat like an oral agreement, right? Like, so, I mean, of course, so that was interesting for me, and I would be happy to hear a few more examples that where such specific, deals were done, or like this, so that would be interesting. The second is, I think this is more of a question where you say in Mangalore there were network of institutions, and I think over the course of your presentation, you used examples like evening classes, informal collectives. Are they also these kind of institutions?
Work related.
Okay, work related. So schools, evening classes. So I'm interested if you say something like an evening class itself becomes an institutional space, or it's part of the educational institution.
So in this case, I should have explained that a bit better. In this case, it's actually emerged in an institution from the demands articulated by Dalit student activists who want to nurture. Right. So it's coming from there.
Right.
So it becomes an institution for people from a particular caste location to be able to get out of whatever traps they find themselves in. So I see it as an institution from that sense.
Okay.
Not in terms of school hair coaching class and not that institution, but as a vehicle, as a way, means of changing.
Those are pretty much my questions.
Yeah, the bargains, we are rife with examples here, but it's very general.
Okay.
You'd hardly ever find a bargain kind of story from a man. And it's interesting because it's not like they're not making bargains. No, young men are doing the same because they are also victims of patriarchy in whatever way, but they don't represent it. They represent it in a way as if the opportunities were always available to them.
So just a follow up. So in Gaurav and when we went to Mangalore, we also of course, we contacted the same people that you had put us in touch with, and we noticed that there was a lot of local politics is quite active there, and particularly Dalit and tribal active collectives. Even unions, I think they're affiliated to, of course, class organizations and things like that. So, from your presentation, I could get the sense that they sort of see, like there is that activism that sort of seeps into something like evening classes as well.
Okay, so there's also this passing of that network, right? So for example, these two people we interviewed, they were friends, a girl and a boy, Dalits, who talked about all these things, and then their work, they were working, doing some remunerative work, but all their time outside of their working hours was being fed back into this sort of an activist group, which was then nurturing other young people. So it's also that the fact that those social networks are very active and they're organized along lines of caste or class, but mostly caste. Thank you so much. I think there's a comment from Madhu.
Yeah. Should I get her to? I'll just on.
No, I mean, yeah, we can.
Okay.
Question.
If you, Madhu Suthan Sharma, if you want to ask a question, add it to the comment. I don't know. I don't.
No, but just to answer, it's absolutely right. One of the more fascinating things that we found in Kishangarh was that, at the time that I was doing my research, I think you have to move the camera. At the time that I was doing my research, there were a bunch of new mines that had opened in Andhra Pradesh. So immediately, owners of mines here were setting up operations and investing in mines there. And so trained machine operators from Kishangarh were being sent there to train the machine operators. So all of this exchange of knowledge, labor, and so yes, there is a certain sort of skill and specialization that then they can take to other places. I'm not aware of international work. I didn't come across that in my fieldwork.
I just had a comment, which is just there is this new book out, Desperately Seeking Shahrukh, which also talks about informal women and their ambitions, and it is essentially not about Shahrukh, and also a little bit about Shahrukh, but more book at the end of this PhD. And at that point, I mean, I think the two projects really answered that very bland question of why is it that women are not there in formal employment, even though there is a higher stake in education, and the fact that there are more women who are getting educated, but their role in employment is. So I think you're able to really puncture that question, like what do you mean by employment, and also these are the networks that are networks of negotiations within which firstly they're getting educated and then they're using their education to get some kind of employment. I just a tiny question about transport, as in how and where, like Kishangarh is not, as you said, it is neither urban, neither, it's sort of in the somewhere in between as most of these. I'm just thinking about when you are negotiating with family, you're also negotiating built environment, and so you travel. So how do you? What is risky travel? What is safe travel? How do you negotiate boundaries with travel, like in terms of daily? Um,
Yeah, so this was the big issue in Kishangarh, right? If you were in the city and you were from ironically, if you were from a well-to-do family, you had your own scooty, and typical small town India, you would zip across, but the surveillance on your mobility was high.
right.
So you could zip across with the scooty, but somebody somewhere would likely report back to your family what you were doing. Everybody else used the shared auto, the paratransit system. And I actually saw a recent study somewhere, where the commuters who were coming in from the 1 or 2 hour radius outside Kishangarh, men were disproportionately using private transport, so bikes.
Right.
You didn't see women on scooties coming in. So these young girls in villages like Kotri did not have access to scooties. They were not provided that kind of safe transport option by their families, whereas the young men in the family were given bikes too because their work was seen as important. Whereas the women were going to study, and all that was going to come out of the education was perhaps a slightly better marriage proposal. So the
Right.
expectation was not that that education would turn to remunerative work. And women who were actually working in Kishangarh were walking to work. So there was no question of using transport. And they were walking to work in such short distances that they kept evoking the idea of the safe mohalla. That शहर safe नहीं है, लेकिन हमारा मोहल्ला safe है. So if you're working within a 1 or 2 kilometer radius of your home, you know people, and that knowing people keeps you safe was the notion. Mangalore is very different. There's a very well set up network of transportation. Of course, there are issues around late and early and darkness and safety. I mean, those kind of larger issues, but there wasn't like a question of I don't have the infrastructure to do this. So you saw women using private transport also,
Right.
scooties, and also using public transport. And in fact, in public transport, the gender ratio would be almost 50-50. If you stood at the bus terminal and saw in the morning people getting off, you would see a lot of women, like 30-40% of the people getting off the buses would be women.
Okay, all right. Just a tangential question on fertility. Were you interested at all on the
What?
fertility? Like what kind of families are they interested in? Or that was not part of your study at all? Okay, great. Okay,
No,
okay. I'm gonna keep
yeah,
it.
this question of reproduction and
No, no,
ideas
that's
around
fine.
that wasn't something because
Yeah,
we were so focused on youth and employment
yeah.
or labor market kind of questions.
That's in a way more interesting than that. It's okay. It's fine.
I think Gaurav has a question.
Oh, okay. Purnima also has a question, but Gaurav should go first.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Aparita. Sorry. It's on, right? You can hear.
Yeah, I can hear. There's a bit of a go ahead.
Yeah. So my question is slightly broader, Mukta. I'm just thinking, do you see in your work any a theory of urbanization in small cities emerging? And when I say a theory, I mean there has been work on subaltern urbanization, there's work on ordinary cities, but what do you see any specificity in Indian small cities? Or do you see that it's not a theory, it may be many theories and it can have like regional variation or something like that? How basically I want to understand how do you frame urbanization in smaller cities, which are not census towns, but small in scale.
Yeah, I mean, as I got into my research, I think more and more I started. Sorry. Can you hear me, Prajita? Am I audible?
Yeah.
So I think I got more and more into this whole idea of the political economy of a city and the relationship between sort of formal structures of urbanization in terms of invest. So in Mangalore, this tension is very apparent, where you have the New Mangalore port and the SEZ and these sort of formal infrastructure investments. And then there's a whole other set of things that are happening through these political economy kind of channels. And I'm still grappling about, I mean, I think all Indian cities are kind of formed like that. Perhaps an initial articulation of that is that this role of political economy in smaller cities is very prominent, and prominent in a way that it affects day-to-day life and daily governance, rather than maybe in a metropolis where there is some sort of an organization of the daily life and all these things are happening, but they're happening at a higher level, which is not visible to the ordinary person. I don't know. That's one way, that one thought that has occurred to me. I wasn't trying, I think, to come up with, but it's a great question, Gaurav. So I think I'm still struggling with this, and struggling with it particularly because this question of small and the scalar nature of cities is still something which is hard to grapple, especially because I chose this dissimilar case studies kind of approach, where the contextual differences are so high that it's kind of hard to, generalize some of the, it's been hard to abstract out of it, but I will think more about it. So Prajita, before it gets to book, I have to answer Gaurav's question clearly.
No, you'll do that. Okay, Purnima, Tarini, just hold on. Purnima is, I'll just allow you to speak. Yeah, go ahead, ask your question.
Hi, thanks Mukta for this really interesting study. And I think going to catch up on a point that you have probably discussed earlier as well, which Bharti picked up on, which is to do with the contextual differences across these two spaces and the differences that you were speaking about between Kishangarh and Mangalore, especially with respect to pre-existing local networks of NGOs, activists, perhaps other local organizations working on caste and other issues, and the extent to which that mediates or influences how people think about and develop their own ideas of aspirations, personal aspirations, social aspirations, both in terms of work as well as mobility. And did you because there are these differences, and to what extent do you think you can comment on the need for such institutions, whether they're even to the extent of, say, vocational training programs, which I don't know if you actually studied such programs, but I was wondering, the role of these external institutions and how they sort of help mediate and offer spaces to young people to be able to come to and realize and self-discover.
So you use the word external, Purnima, and I think that's where I would really focus there. So it depends on where the genesis of these institutions themselves. So, when they're coming up from a need that is already embedded and it's being articulated in some way, and then so it's a very localized sort of generation of that institution, it actually does play a far more successful role in doing this. But when it's a top-down intervention like a national urban livelihoods mission, skills training program, or a program that offers loans to entrepreneurs, that has much more mixed results, in the sense that the awareness, it's much more dependent on how good or bad the implementation is. And so because it's coming it's not conceptualized in the fabric of that city itself. So when I was talking about those evening classes, which were sort of coming out from the Dalit collectives, it was a very specific response, and the network that would respond to that intervention was already there because it came out of that. So it's very effective, but it's not effective in Mangalore. There is an entrepreneurship sort of incubation center that the district administration has set up with the help of some private sector players. And it's not, some interesting things are happening. Some people are, incubating some businesses there, but I don't see it as doing something earth-shattering. Even they were disappointed with the fact that they were even sometimes struggling to fill all the seats in their incubation center, because it's just seen as an idea that's parachuting out of somewhere. In IT companies opening campuses there, they're not able to retain employees because the scale isn't there. It makes sense for an employee to work there for 6 months and then move to a Hyderabad or a Bangalore, because there's no work profile change that happens. So what kind of so it's a little bit of that also, and also answers Gaurav's question about these in-between kind of cities, which are large in terms of population, but their economies don't offer the kind of diversity to retain young people in jobs there. And that then contributes to a sort of unending mobility and a pursuit of better and better opportunities.
Thanks.
More of a stream of consciousness response than a very.
Those are the best. Tarini, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. So I had to ask that in your study, did you come across any particular women in non-traditional job roles, and if there were any particular observations related to that in these two cities that you're focusing on?
So we heard of a lot of women in non-traditional job roles, and also traditional job roles, tradition, non-tradition also changed across cities. So what was acceptable in Mangalore would not have been acceptable in Kishangarh, and so on and so forth. So in Mangalore, we did see, occasionally employers talked about women on their factory floor, for instance. In the industrial sector, of course, there were very feminized industrial work. For example, agro-based industries like cashew and tobacco and so on and so forth have had a very feminized workforce for a long time. But yeah, machine operation and this is also about how yeah, male aspirations in a place like Mangalore seem to be centered around exit. So they want to get some skills, they want to get some experience, and then they want to move to a Bangalore or a Bombay, or so there is a metropolitan aspiration there, whereas women are not necessarily thinking of moving that far away. Hence, in some of the industrial sectors, industrial clusters that are still sort of running, a lot of Mangalore is sort of getting de-industrialized, and the industrial sectors are kind of sick. Factories are sick and stuff like that. But the ones that are prevailing are sort of, we do see women working there. And I haven't actually interviewed any of those women, but I do hear from skills institutions and from employers that every now and then there are women in the workforce, but nothing more than that.
Thank you.
Okay, and Anushri, do you want to? I've already unmuted you. You can go ahead and ask your question and keep a little short, please. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's just the question that I've typed out. That's what I just wanted to ask. Like, maybe mostly like it's mainly a question about asking for maybe some recommendations for reading things around that. But the ordinary cities framework, Mukta, that you just mentioned as one kind of a theoretical underpinning for your work, I found that really interesting as a way specifically to look at like a feminist imagination of the city, and if there are like any particular kinds of parallels that you think can be thought of between these particular geographies that you have been looking at, and especially the peri-urban areas of metropolitan cities themselves. The question is also coming from some of my own work, which is located around the peri-urban sort of areas around Hyderabad. So yeah, like just if you can, talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I've been sort of struggling myself with, I haven't really looked at peri-urban work so much, though in the broader work that we've been doing on migration, this question of the peri-urban has definitely come up a lot more than before, simply because in the larger metropolitan cities, migrants are so concentrated now in peri-urban locations, and then even the work opportunities for women are so sort of are self-dictated by those peri-urban living conditions. I haven't really thought about how to bring these things together. So something that I would need to think about.
Sure, of course, that makes sense. Thank you.
All right. Any more questions? Partha, do you want to?
Yeah. If I can just push one story on, just come up in this discussion, which sort of seemed quite a clear difference when you presented Mangalore and Kishangarh, is the fact that when you're talking about these two cities, Mangalore seemed to have a lot of institutions. Kishangarh didn't, at least when you presented, didn't seem to have so many. And the other issue that you pointed out during the discussion was this issue of transport, both public transport and structures, etc. So I'm just trying to understand, is that in your mind a function of scale vis-a-vis, let's say, a town like Kishangarh and a sort of small city like Mangalore? Or do you think it is a nature of the industry? Is it a nature of the social context? If you were to sort of theorize about what leads to the presence of these mediating institutions in Bangalore and the absence of it, to what would you attribute it?
Yeah, so I think a little bit of both. Scale, perhaps, well, Kishangarh is 150 people, 150,000 people plus. So, I mean, it's not that small. If you think about, if institutions had to come up, they could have come up in that context too. But it's really the diversification story. I mean, Mangalore has many different kinds of economic activity happening there. There's a history of unionization. It's 15 kilometers away from the Kerala border. That whole area has had a history. The labor, even the governance capacities, the labor department actually reports very high compliance among firms for labor laws and so on and so forth. In Kishangarh, I didn't find the labor department office open. It's not the district headquarters, so the labor department doesn't have a permanent presence there. But there's really very, very little, because it's, it's also basically, I'm saying that it's a governance structure story and an economic sort of activity diversification story that I see. And the third story I see related to these is the presence and the influence of politicians and local elites in the operation of the city and the daily life of the city itself. So in Kishangarh, for example, if you would try to, and we did have these conversations, if you would try to establish a collective, there would be an active pushback and a breakup of the collective. So you will not be able to form a union in Kishangarh very easily. At least in the marble sector.
Yeah.
Maybe in the domestic work sector, but again, in the domestic work sector, the caste hierarchies are so Kishangarh is a lot more like the village in terms of how entrenched the caste hierarchies are. Mangalore, the caste identities are very strong, but there is also a larger space and a history of resistance and negotiation. So yes, the Dalit youth in Mangalore were reporting discrimination, but they were also then reporting a very long history of resistance and these kind of institutions. They're not new institutions in that sense. They've been around for a while. Also just simply from a demographic composition perspective, Kishangarh is very largely SC. Whereas Mangalore has a much higher proportion of general caste.
And how do you think that affects the
So a concentrated small number of powerful elites who all know each other and who can influence politics in a very, very, single direction. Whereas in Mangalore, even that is distributed among a larger number of people. So there's a contestation and there's a power play happening there. So they also have to do things to remain relevant. They have to engage with other kinds of groups in the city. So it's much more unidirectional and concentrated in the Kishangarh context, perhaps as a function of its size, of its smaller size, and the fact that if you attack one industry, you've kind of done a lot already. I mean, if you can control land, the real estate bit, which is now becoming important in the context of all this new infrastructure, there's a lot more speculative land investment happening. And if you can get at marble, I mean, the stone industry, you pretty much control the economy and the sort of politics of the city.
Which is interesting. So Anirudh has to look up the structure. You want to come in, Anirudh, and you seem to have a particular take on this.
No,
Yes.
no, I think we are all aware of it. I don't think I have particularly any new insights to add. But when you travel through South India, whether it's a small town or a large town, you can see that in every respect that you think of it, whether it's the quality of human resources, you walk into office, or any kind of HDI, in general, the South is progressed much more for a wide variety of reasons. And this has always been a question in my mind. And I've had some answers to it about why, in spite of all the corruption in politics, etc., which the South is no less than the North or any other part of the country, the South seems to still deliver better, right? Whether it's you deliver on Manrega better, you deliver on midday meal schemes better, or what have you.
Yeah.
And the North is not. And my travels through North, the way it is, you go to small micro businesses, there's an attempt at every stage to say evade taxes, for example, or how do you employ informal labor and not pay the labor dues. And you go to South, it's very different, relatively speaking. And these are just two different countries, in my view, in some ways. And that's a challenge for us and worth thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said.
Seems way too structural explanation from which you can start that story. And back to you, Aparajita.
I don't see any more questions. I think, do you, Mukta, do you want to have it, that you want to close off with some comments, or are you happy?
No, I mean, these have been really insightful comments. And of course, the ones that I did not answer or completely fumbled are the ones that I need to think hardest about in terms of questions. So really grateful to everyone, all of you, for engaging so sort of deeply with what I was trying to say. There is another paper that I'm sort of putting into publication right now, which looks at the full sample, not just the women, but like the full sample, which has a lot more texture, but is also struggling with exactly these kind of larger theorization issues. So these are really useful comments for that paper.
All right. Okay, so with that, I think we can conclude this workshop session, and we'll have another speaker ready for the next session in the last Tuesday of the next month. You'll get a poster as and when the speaker is there and confirmed. Okay, thank you so much. And I'm going to end the meeting. You guys can carry on from here, right?
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Yeah, bye. Yeah, okay. Yes, okay.